The Zwift Ride is an interesting indoor training tool consisting of the Wahoo Kickr Core Smart Trainer, this massive steel bike, and video game controls for navigating around inside the world of Zwift, which has in recent years become synonymous with indoor training. I've logged over 500 miles on this thing, and in this video I will give you all the sweaty pros and cons about the bike and the setup. Tell you who this will work well for, who it will not work well for at all, give you some comparisons to other smart bikes and trainers on the marketplace, talk about some DIY solutions similar to this, and I'll answer some of your questions. If you want to follow me on Instagram or Strava to see what I'm testing and put in questions before I do a video, I'll put those links down in the video description below. And of course, I'll give you my take on what it was like for me in my own personal test case, including rehabbing a busted up shoulder. In recent years, I've tested way too many smart bikes and smart trainers. And at this point, I just want a indoor setup that is easy to use, that's quiet, that's easy to clean, and is easy to deal with, not only when I'm using it during the winter, but then the other 8 months out of the year when I want the thing out of my way. My personal indoor training setup is an older Wahoo Kickr, and then the trusty old Specialized Tarmac rim brake bike, which, very much unlike this, I can hang on the wall without having to use a pulley system, and I can even ride the thing outside. This test bike, like all the test bikes, was not a paid thing, loaned to me by the manufacturer, and then I will return it at the end of the review. If you find this video helpful, please take a second to subscribe, tell your friends. Now sit back and enjoy the ride on the Zwift Ride. Before we get into it, two quick things. One, this only works fully on Zwift, in that the shifting does not work on Trainer Road or other platforms. The erg mode still works, but the shifting and the buttons do not. Secondly, the cranks are 170 millimeter only. Unlike, say, the Wahoo Kickr smart bike, this, you only have one crank length option. So if either of those two are deal breakers, congratulations, the rest of your time just freed up. You don't have to watch the rest of the video. If those aren't deal breakers, settle in. We'll get into all the details now. Let's start with a quick overview of parts and cost. You can get this entire setup as is for $1,300. You can get the Kickr Core with the Zwift Cog and the little click shifter for $500. You can get just the frame and the controls without the smart trainer for $800. And you can get the Play controllers, these guys, which are basically everything here except the shifters in a slightly smaller package that you can put on any bike, for 100 bucks. Outside the reality of this bike, the Zwift Cog on a compatible trainer means you can use it with virtually any type of bike. 10 speed, 11 speed, 13 speed, because there's just a single cog, and then there's a digital shifter to operate that. I'll put a link to the list of compatible trainers in the video description, and you can watch that video on the origins and some of my thoughts on how the Zwift Cog works. Initially it came out for a Zwift trainer. Zwift has done away with that, and now Zwift is again playing nice with other makers like Wahoo and Jet Black and Elite and others to take the Zwift Cog and put it onto any trainer. Initially I wanted to test this Zwift Ride bike on the Kickr that I have, because it's a higher end Kickr than the Core, which is the second tier Kickr. Unfortunately, my version is version 5, and it needs to be version 6 or above to work with this. So technology, what are you gonna do? Now, those parts aside, I'll just talk about the Zwift Ride as a whole. Pros, cons, who it would be terrible for, who it could be good for, how it was for me. Let's start with the pros. One, it's pretty simple to set up. There is a single 6mm wrench, snaps on here, that works for the axle, works to adjust saddle height, works to adjust handlebar height, and works to adjust handlebar reach. There's a little card that comes with the thing where you can indicate, once you've got your setup dialed, what the alphabetized fit coordinates are, that being useful if you have multiple people in the house and you're switching the thing back and forth. Which brings up another point. Even if there's just one of you using the thing, having a bike like this effectively lets you play with some different positions. So instead of buying a different stem for your outdoor bike, or buying different handlebars, or buying an entirely different bike for stack and reach. You can just mess around with the cockpit to see what feels good. I don't know if that's a reason to buy something like this, but there's a side benefit that's effectively like a smaller, dumbed down version of a Serata cycle or a Retool Move fit bike. The saddle also moves fore and aft. The saddle rails are a little on the shorter side, so you don't have quite as much flexibility as you would a normal bike, but if you don't like the saddle, it's a standard circular rail mount, so you can swap that out. I found it to be pretty comfortable. It's roughly like a Specialized Power-ish shape, stubby, wide, a little channel down the middle. Another benefit of a dedicated indoor bike of any type is that you're not sweating your corrosive sweat all over your outdoor bike, most notably in the headset, although your sweat can also damage the shifters or the attachment bolts there. If you doubt that, call up your trusty Canadian or other far northern mechanic who works on bikes after people have been riding them indoors over the winter. Sweat can be a nasty thing. Similarly, compared to a regular smart trainer and your normal bike, you don't have to take the thing off and on, which can be a pain and a dirty mess depending on the conditions where you happen to live. And then of course another primary benefit of this bike is the controllers. You can shift the trainer, you can brake. I don't know why you'd want to brake in Zwift. You can steer, another feature of dubious value. But then the buttons, in my experience, have been quite useful, particularly when I can barely move my arm. But even now that I've got a bit more functionality, being able to keep your hands on the bars and not get your sweaty palms all over your laptop is a benefit. That's a convenient thing. That's a protective thing for your laptop. Yes, you can use this with a tablet, but most folks, myself included, use a laptop sometimes with a monitor. But then also you have controls to use within the game to do things like jump around to different pace partners while you're riding, to increase or decrease the workout intensity, to take a coffee break where your little avatar can coast along after 30 minutes of riding, and other features. So there's nothing in here that you can't do on the laptop. It's just a lot easier to do right here in the ride. Things like hitting power-ups while riding, or especially while racing, having that at the fingertips is a definite plus. Now the cons. None of this is particularly high-end. Not that you're going to be taking a steel frame outside, but just things like the plasticky feel isn't quite as comfortable as I suspect your dedicated road bike is. The Kickr core is a solid trainer, but it's not Wahoo's top-end Kickr, so the accuracy is not as good as the top-end one. It is wobbly, particularly on the right side. The trainer is offset to the right, which normally isn't so much of a big deal because the heavy flywheel on the left offsets things, but this massive steel frame means it's a lot easier to lean to the right than it is to the left. I haven't been doing any sprinting on this because I can barely pull with my arm, but as you can see, it's not too hard to get the thing to walk around. Stability up front is about the same as having a front wheel, except it's just a single column. So the offset at the rear is a bit of a spot for improvement, I think. 170mm cranks. If you already ride those, fantastic. If not, if you're close to it, it's not necessarily too much of a big deal. I normally do 172.5, so this isn't too far off. If you're a very tall or very old school person, 177.5, that would be a huge jump. Similarly, if you're a tiny person, that would be an obnoxious jump. Zwift says they're aware of this situation and we may see other crank lengths in the future. Wattbike, a British manufacturer of smart bikes, also has just this one single 170mm length. You could chalk that up to a close association with track riding. Wahoo Kickr Smart Bike has multiple crank length choices built into the one fanned out crank. And of course, if you're using your own bike, then your crank length is already dialed. This configuration, I think, is odd. It allows you to, with a single 6mm bolt, adjust your reach and it's got this rubber cover which is labeled with a water bottle, a slice of pizza, and a donut. In my experience, this is just a giant sweat collector in that it sits right under my chin, and because of the concave shape, it just collects a bunch of sweat and then it runs down into a little hole here. So I'm concerned with what could go on here after multiple winters of use. Another thing that's a little obnoxious about this is if you use a floor mounted fan the way I do, like the Wahoo Headwind, it just blocks a lot of the air that would otherwise get up to if you were using a normal road bike. It is a handy place to put your phone or snacks or other things, so it's not the end of the world, but it's, in my mind, not fully optimized for the indoor riding experience. Along similar lines, the plastic controllers end up collecting a bit of sweat around the buttons. That's not a big deal, but it could benefit from a bit of drainage. Another nit to pick, this thing's a tank. The controllers each have their own USB-C charging port. The thing comes with a split tail charging cable that you can plug in here. In my mind, it would be a lot cleaner if that was all internal, but the things hold a charge for I don't know how many hours, so you don't have to have it plugged in all the time, but once they're plugged in, it's not as clean as could be. So who is this potentially a good solution for? Well, if you live in a household with multiple riders and no smart trainers, this could be a way to get everybody in the game with a single unit. It is, like I said, really only useful for Zwift, so if you use TrainerRoad or other platforms, this is not the move. For a do-it-yourself version of this, you can start with an old frame you already have, or you can pick up used for cheap. It doesn't need to be a complete bike. You don't need to have shifters or brakes or wheels, just the frame, cranks, seat post, handlebar, saddle, and you're off and running. Pair that with any smart trainer. There's a lot of good ones out there, and prices seem to be coming down. The Ceres H3, for instance, is like under $400 now. I suggest you check out Tariq Hali's channel, which is all about smart trainers. The guy's an expert on that. And of course, old DC Ray at DC Rainmaker has plenty of reviews on the latest and greatest smart trainers. So that is a way to go. And then you can just add the Zwift Play controllers if you want this type of functionality for Zwift. And that is a $100 thing, and those are often on sale too. On the other end of the spectrum, if you want to go full smart bike, the Wahoo has a couple options from $2,500 to $3,800, and then Watt Bike right now is on sale for $2,400, down from $3,000. So that's the higher end choices, and then you've got the do-it-yourself choices. All right, now let's hit some of your questions from Instagram. What's the tire clearance on that, bro? I know it's a gravel channel and tire clearance is a thing. You could probably fit a tire, it doesn't matter. Similarly, how aero is it? Probably decently so, I'd say. It's pretty fat. How much drag is added by this pulley? This is the mechanism for keeping the chain taut since there is no derailleur system. I'm sure it adds a nominal amount of resistance. If you're that concerned with the absolute minimum of friction, you're probably not looking at this type of setup anyhow. What's the stability like? Well, as I mentioned, it tips a lot easier over to the right than to the left, but it's generally close to as stable as a standard bike on most trainers, just a little bit skewed to the right. How quiet is it? Pretty quiet. The Cog is a bit noisier than a nice, well-maintained free hub, especially if you're running a silk wax that's nice and quiet, but it's by no means a noisy unit. And the Kickr core is relatively quiet. Can you use it with other platforms? Yes and no. The erg mode, in which resistance is controlled by a game or a software like TrainerRoad or Ruvi, that part works across the board, but the whole point of this thing, being able to shift with the Zwift Cog, that only works within Zwift. So effectively, no, it's not really a good setup for anything but Zwift. How easy is it to use? Pretty easy. Just turn the controllers on, and then the interface is, if you're a Zwift user, what you're accustomed to, you're just doing this instead of using your keyboard. So simple. Is it any good? Depends on what you're trying to do. As I mentioned at the top of the video, at this point I'm interested in something that is easy to use, that requires minimal fussing with, and it's easy to deal with in the instances where I'm not using it. I wish that the frame didn't weigh 1,000 pounds, because I'd like to be able to hang it up on the wall when I'm not using it, and this is like 60 plus pounds or something, so that is really not an option. So for all the rest of the months when you're not using it, it is far inferior to having an old bike frame that you could just hang up on a hook. What I do really love about it is the button functionality, especially when I had very limited arm mobility. Being able to jump around with the pace partners in particular is something that I love with this. I'll warm up at a slower rate, jump up to a higher watts per kilo for a bit, and then cool down with another pace partner. So being able to do that just, you know, from the controllers here is a cool thing. Again, you can get the Play $100 add-ons and have that functionality without the bike, but that is something that I've definitely appreciated more than I thought in the last couple months. As far as shifting, you get a little tactile feel here, but it's not quite as gratifying as a mechanical shift, and that's a whole other can of worms. That mechanical shifting has already gone the way of the dodo bird for Shimano and SRAM on the high end for the most part, but that's something that I kind of miss, just the feel from the trusty old road bike here, but that's a pretty small nit to pick. So that's my take after riding 500 miles on the Zwift Ride. No, I didn't do it all at once. Once upon a time, I did do 500 kilometers in one ride as a fundraiser for World Bicycle Relief. Let me know what questions you have about this guy. I'll do my best to answer them in the comments below. As always, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you subscribing. And whether you're riding something like this inside or something like that outside, I hope you can enjoy the ride.